Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. I'm glad you're here because today's story is a little different from what we usually cover on this channel. There's no bar, no dating app, no string of late-night video calls with a woman he'd never met. This one starts in a shopping mall, in broad daylight, with a man who considered himself sensible. A man who had spent nearly 4 decades in a trade that punishes carelessness. A man who, by every reasonable measure, should have known better. His name is Brendan. He's 63 years old, from Limerick, in the west of Ireland. He worked as a commercial electrician, his whole adult life hospitals, industrial estates, shopping centres across Munster. Not a man who makes rash decisions, not a man given to sentiment or dramatics. He checks things twice. He reads the manual. He does not touch a wire until he knows exactly where it leads. And yet, Brendan came to the Philippines at a point in his life when the ground had shifted beneath him in ways he hadn't fully processed. What happened next took nearly 2 years to fully unfold, cost him more than he can comfortably say out loud, and ended with a woman sitting outside his hotel room door in tears, begging him for mercy. Whether she got it, well, that's what we're here to find out. This one's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. I'll start at the beginning, and the beginning isn't the Philippines. The beginning is a solicitor's office on O'Connell Street in Limerick on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 2021. I'm sitting across a desk from a man I'm paying €400 an hour, and he's sliding a document toward me, and I'm signing it. And that's more or less that. 26 years. 2 kids. A house I'd spent 15 years doing up room by room with my own 2 hands, rewired it myself, obviously, replumbed half of it, built the extension out the back, and I'm signing it away on a Tuesday morning, and then I'm walking out onto O'Connell Street in the rain, and I haven't got a clue what to do with myself. Siobhan got the house. I got slightly more than half the equity, which, at the time, worked out to around €155,000, and I got the flat in Dooradoyle which I was renting, and which had that particular quality of rented flats that I'd forgotten about, the way they don't absorb any sound, the way every noise you make just bounces off the walls and comes back at you. People ask, was it bitter, the divorce? And honestly, no. That's the strange part. It wasn't bitter. It was just quiet. Just this long, slow unwinding over years until one day you realize there's nothing left to unwind. No screaming rose, no dramatic revelation, nothing you could point to and say, there. That's when it went wrong. It went wrong the way a wall socket goes wrong when there's a loose connection behind the plaster. You don't see it, you don't smell it, and then one day something just stops working. I was 61 years old. I'd retired the previous year on a modest pension from the trade. 2 kids. Ioife is in Melbourne, Kairan is in Perth. Good kids, busy lives. They rang on birthdays and Christmas and occasionally in between, and that was fine. That was as it should be. I didn't want them worrying about me. The $155,000 sat in my current account, and I looked at it the way you look at something that should feel like good news, but doesn't. It wasn't savings. It was the house converted into numbers. 30 years of work and mortgage payments and weekends on your hands and knees in the attic, and at the end of it you've got a number on a screen. Right, I retired into nothing, is the honest way to put it. The work had been the structure of everything. Up at 6:30, on site by 7:30. You had a job, you had a crew, you had a problem to solve and tools to solve it with. And then suddenly there's none of that, just the flat in Dooradoyle and the television and the rain on the window. I'm not someone who goes to the pub to fill the time, never have been. I don't play golf. I didn't have hobbies, not really. The house had been the hobby, and that was gone. I walked a lot, I read a bit, and I watched YouTube, which is what you do at 11:30 at night when you're 61 and alone and you can't sleep. That's how the Philippines came into it. I couldn't tell you exactly which video it was that started it. One of those retirement abroad things. How far does your pension go in Southeast Asia? Cost of living comparisons. Some lad walking around a market in Cebu City talking about how he'd bought a motorbike and was living well on €1,200 a month. I watched it, then I watched another one, then another. You know how it goes. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I wasn't lonely in the way people might assume. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't sitting there dreaming about finding a young Filipina girlfriend. That wasn't the draw. The draw was simpler and more embarrassing than that. The draw was warmth, literal warmth. The sun. I'd spent 60-odd years in the west of Ireland, and I was tired of being cold. And these videos kept showing blue water and 30 degrees and fruit I'd never heard of, and people who seemed, I don't know, cheerful. Relentlessly cheerful in a way that Limerick in February is not. The Irish logic, as I explained it to my mate Donal, was this: I'm miserable at home. I can be miserable somewhere warm for the same money, or possibly less. Therefore going is the rational decision. Donal told me I was out of my mind. I booked a return flight to Cebu for January 2023. I told myself it was just a Rexy, have a look around, see if the YouTube lads were exaggerating, come home after 3 weeks with a tan and a clear head, and make a sensible decision about whether there was anything to it. I genuinely believed that's what it was. A Rexy. I've done plenty of Rexys in my working life. You go on site before the job starts. You assess the layout. You identify where the problems are going to be. You plan accordingly. That's the theory. The thing about this particular Rexy was that I'd already decided before I got on the plane. I just hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I landed at Mactan Airport on a Wednesday afternoon in January. Stepped out of the terminal, and the heat hit me like opening a commercial oven. That wet, dense heat that gets into your clothes immediately. The smell of it, diesel and something floral and something else I couldn't identify. The noise. Horns. People calling out. A row of drivers holding up names on cardboard. Pure chaos. And I stood there in it for a moment thinking, right. This is a different place entirely. The hotel in IT Park was fine. Clean, air-conditioned, a pool I didn't use. I spent the first few days just walking around, getting my bearings. Getting used to the fact that everywhere I went, people were friendly to me in a way that felt slightly startling after 2 years of being largely invisible. I was a Kano. That's what they call Western men here. From Americano, and being a Kano meant people assumed you had money, which relative to most people around me, I suppose I did. I want to be honest about that. Part of the pull was being somewhere that treated you like you mattered. I'm not proud of that, but there it is. On the 4th day, I walked into Ayala Mall, no particular reason, just air conditioning and somewhere to be. I wandered into a clothing boutique on the ground floor. And that's where I met Malicel. She was folding something on a display table near the entrance. Didn't look up immediately. That was the first thing I noticed. Actually, she didn't clock me walking in and immediately recalibrate. She just finished what she was doing, set it down, and then looked up and said, "Good afternoon, Poe. Can I help you find something?" Professional, unhurried, like I was a customer and she was a supervisor. And that was the full extent of what was happening. I told her I was just browsing. She nodded and went back to what she was doing, which was arranging a rack of women's blouses. I spent about 10 minutes in that shop looking at things I had absolutely no use for. Bought nothing. Left. I came back 2 days later. I want to say I had a reason. I'd thought of something to buy for Ioife, my daughter in Melbourne. A pasalubong, the locals call it, a gift when you're traveling. That's what I told myself. Whether that was the actual reason or whether I just wanted to walk back into that particular shop on that particular afternoon, I'll leave you to judge. Maricel remembered me, not in a dramatic way, just a quick recognition, a small smile, a hello again. I bought a scarf for Oife. Maricel wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, which nobody had done for me in a very long time, and when I was paying, she asked, almost as an aside, "Were you an electrician, then?" Because I'd been looking at the track lighting on the ceiling on my way in, the way you always do when you're in the trade, assessing it without meaning to. She'd noticed. I said yes, I was. 38 years, mostly commercial work. She said, "What kind of buildings?" And that was it. That was the question that started everything. Not because it was clever or calculated, just because it was the right question. Nobody had asked me about my work in months. Years, maybe, in any way that seemed genuinely curious. We talked for 20 minutes in the doorway of that shop while her colleague minded the till. And she asked about hospitals and factories and what it was like to wire a building from scratch. And I found myself explaining things I'd never had to put into words before. The logic of a distribution board, the satisfaction of a clean install. She listened the way people listen when they're actually interested, not when they're waiting for their turn to speak. She suggested a coffee if I wasn't in a rush. There was a place 2 floors up. I wasn't in a rush. I hadn't been in a rush in about 2 years. We sat there for an hour and a half. She was from Bohol originally, she said, a place called Tagbilaran. She'd come to Cebu for work 8 years ago. She had a daughter, 14, doing well in school. Her mother was still in Bohol, in a small house in a barangay outside the city. She spoke about all of this matter-of-factly, not performing poverty or hardship, just describing her life. She was 38. She'd been married briefly when she was young. She mentioned it once and didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. She was Catholic, serious about it, went to Mass on Sundays without fail. She did not ask me about money, not once. Not how much I had, not how much I'd spent on the trip, not what my pension was. She asked about Ireland. Was it really always raining? Had I been to Dublin much? Did I like spicy food? Because she could recommend good places to eat if I didn't mind a bit of heat. She asked what I thought of Cebu so far, and I gave her my honest answer, which was that it was overwhelming and loud, and I had no idea what anything cost yet, and I'd nearly been flattened by a jeepney that morning crossing the road. She laughed at that. A real laugh, not a performance. And I remember thinking, when's the last time I made someone laugh? I walked back to the hotel that evening along Colin Street, past the tricycles and the street vendors selling fish balls on skewers, the smell of grilling meat mixing with exhaust, a group of kids on a stoop with a Bluetooth speaker playing something I didn't recognize. The noise of it, the life of it. And I was thinking, well, maybe extend the stay a bit. No harm in that. Now, here's what I want to say to anyone watching this who's been to Cebu or who's thinking about going. The city is genuinely like that. The warmth isn't manufactured. People are friendly. They're curious. They have a quality of attention that's different from what I was used to at home. I'm not saying I wasn't susceptible to it. I clearly was. A 61-year-old man who's been invisible for 2 years is going to notice when someone actually talks to him. That's not a Filipino trick. That's just being human and hungry for connection. What I didn't fully account for was that my hunger was obvious. You might not know you're wearing it on your face, but other people can see it. I couldn't see it. I thought I was just a man having a coffee and a chat. I was actually a man who hadn't felt like himself in 2 years, sitting across from someone who made him feel like himself again. And there is no version of that story where the man is thinking clearly. We exchanged numbers before I left the mall. WhatsApp. She said if I wanted recommendations for restaurants or day trips to let her know, she was happy to help. I said I would. I thanked her for the company. She said it was her pleasure. And she meant it, or she seemed to, and at this point in the story those two things were still the same. I went back to the hotel, opened my laptop, checked flights back to Dublin, and then, without closing that tab, opened another one and looked at how much it would cost to extend my stay by 10 days. It wasn't expensive. less than €200 to change the return date. I sat looking at the screen for a while. Outside, somewhere in IT Park, a karaoke machine was running through a Tagalog ballad that drifted up through my window, all emotion and vibrato. Even that seemed less irritating than it had the night before. I changed the flight. I want to be precise about something before I go any further, because I think it's important for anyone watching this who might find themselves in a similar situation. When I tell people what happened to me in the Philippines, the first thing they assume is that I was taken in by some obvious scam, that I was one of those men. You know the type they mean. Older fellow, lonely, goes to Southeast Asia looking for a young girlfriend, hands over his money, gets played for a fool. And I understand why they assume that. Because from the outside, I suppose that's what it looks like. But that's not what this was. Or at least, it's not what it felt like from the inside. And the distance between those two things, what something is and what it feels like, that's the gap that cost me everything. I extended the stay by 10 days. Maricel and I met for dinner twice that first week, lunch once, and a day trip to Mawalbol along the coast where the road winds through hills and then drops down to water so clear it barely looks real. We took a habal, one of those motorcycle taxis the last stretch, because the road was too narrow for anything bigger, and she held my arm so she didn't slide off the back. I mention that because it was the first time she'd touched me, and it was entirely practical, and somehow that made it more significant than if she'd done it deliberately. We weren't romantic, not yet. We were two people spending time together who both seemed to be enjoying it. She paid for her own food without any discussion. I paid for the day trip, which felt natural given the circumstances. But she didn't expect it, and said so. When I dropped her at the ferry terminal for the boat back to Tagbilaran at the end of my stay, she hugged me briefly and said to come back if I liked it here. Not if I came back she'd be waiting, just if I liked it here. I flew back to Dublin in early February. It was raining, obviously. We talked on WhatsApp most days after that. Not at length, she wasn't a great one for long messages, just checking in. Good morning. How's the weather in Ireland? Did I eat yet? The sort of low-stakes daily contact that fills in the shape of a day when you're on your own. It came back to Cebu in March, then again in May. By the third visit, something had shifted, and we both knew it. We'd had dinner the first night back, and she'd asked quietly, without drama, what exactly was happening between us. Not manipulative, just direct. She deserved a direct answer, and I gave her one, which was that I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted, but I knew I wanted to keep coming back. She thought about this for a moment and said that was honest, Poe, and she appreciated it, and she needed me to understand that she wasn't looking for something casual. She had a daughter. She had responsibilities. She didn't have time for something that was going nowhere. Looking back now, that conversation was one of the things I cited to myself afterward as evidence that she was genuine. A woman running a scam doesn't ask for clarity about your intentions. She just keeps you comfortable and keeps you sending money. That's what I told myself. And maybe I was right. Maybe she was genuine in the beginning. I've thought about this a lot. I don't actually know where the genuine part ended and the calculation began, or whether there was ever a clean line between them at all. The third visit included Bohol. She wanted me to meet her family, which I understood was significant. We took the ferry from the Cebu pier 2 hours across the strait, the sea flat and green, flying fish breaking the surface alongside the hull. Tagbilaran is a small city, tidier than I'd expected, with tricycles everywhere and a central market that smelled of dried fish and overripe mangoes and something sweet I couldn't identify. Her mother's house was about 40 minutes outside the city by tricycle, in a sitio that was really just a cluster of houses along a dirt track. Nipa construction bamboo and palm thatch small, immaculately kept inside. No running water, a pump in the yard. The mother was a small, very upright woman named Nena, maybe 65, with an expression of formal dignity that reminded me of certain older women back in Limerick. She offered me coffee and a plate of puto, little steamed rice cakes, and thanked me for visiting her home. That was all. No performance, no requests, no hint of anything other than a woman receiving a guest with proper courtesy. I liked her immediately. I want to say that plainly. She was a good woman doing her best with what she had, and nothing that happened later changes that. The birthday gathering came at the tail end of that same visit. An uncle's birthday, or possibly a cousin's, I lost track of the relationships. There were so many of them. 20-odd people in a yard behind someone's house, a lechon turning on a spit, a karaoke machine running continuously, children materializing from every direction to stare at the Kano. I ate adobo and pancit and drank 2 San Miguels and had my photo taken what felt like 40 times, and I understood nothing of what anyone was saying to each other, but it didn't matter, because people kept bringing me more food and smiling at me like I'd done something right just by showing up. At some point, Maricel's ate, her older sister, leaned over and said in careful English that it was good Maricel had someone, that she worked too hard, that she deserved a good man. I said something polite in return. I didn't read anything into it at the time. Now I think that was probably not an accidental remark. The roof request came about 6 weeks after that third visit. While I was back in Limerick, Maricel sent me photos on WhatsApp. The Nipa house, a section of roofing that had deteriorated badly, some wall supports that were compromised. Typhoon season was approaching. She wasn't asking, she was explaining the situation. That was how she framed it. Her tone was factual, not distressed. She said she was trying to figure out how to manage it. Now, I am an electrician, not a structural engineer, but I've worked on construction sites for nearly 4 decades, and I have a functional understanding of what repairs cost and what they don't. I looked at those photos carefully. I asked her a few questions. Materials, labor, who she was planning to use. The answers were reasonable. The estimate she came back with was $260,000, roughly $4,200 at the time. I sat with that figure for 2 days. Here is my honest assessment, which I've had a long time to think about. The work probably did need doing. The house probably was in the condition shown in the photos. The amount was probably in the right range for provincial construction costs. I don't believe the roof repair was invented. What I didn't ask was why this was my problem to solve, and I didn't ask it because I knew the answer I'd give myself, which was that I was in a relationship with this woman. Her family had welcomed me, I had money, and she didn't, and it was a roof. Just a roof. It wasn't a gift. It was fixing something that needed fixing. I sent the money via Remitly. Photos arrived a month later of the completed work. The roof was done. The mother sent a message via Maricel that said, "Thank you, Paul, God bless you," and a prayer emoji. I felt good about it for about a week. Then I stopped thinking about it, which is its own kind of warning sign that I completely failed to notice. When you stop thinking about something because thinking about it would complicate the story you're telling yourself, that's not moving on. That's the beginning of a pattern. I just couldn't see the pattern yet. I was too busy feeling useful for the first time in 2 years. By the time June came around, I'd been to the Philippines 4 times, and I'd stopped calling them trips. In my head, they'd become visits. There's a difference. A trip is something you take. A visit is somewhere you go back to. The language had shifted without me noticing, which is usually how the important shifts happen. The relationship had settled into something I can only describe as companionable. I know that doesn't sound like much. But after what I'd come from the silence of the flat, the 2 years of being largely irrelevant to everything companionable felt like an extraordinary thing to have. We weren't giddy. We weren't performing. We cooked dinner in her apartment in Cebu some evenings, ate sinigang and watched Filipino television I didn't understand, and she'd occasionally translate the funny parts. We walked. We talked. She'd quiz me about the wiring and buildings we passed, which I found I enjoyed explaining. I was teaching her something and she was actually learning it, not just pretending to be interested. I was flying over every 2 months now, staying 3 weeks, sometimes 4. The tourist visa gives you 30 days, and you have to sort extensions if you stay longer, which I'd worked out how to do through a local travel agency for about my 3,500 each time, roughly 56, barely worth mentioning. I was extending more often. Then in August, Maricel called me one evening sounding careful, not upset, just careful. She explained that the mall had informed the boutique tenants they were reorganizing the floor space. Her shop was losing its lease in September. The job was gone. I asked what she was thinking of doing. She was already thinking of something. That was the thing about Maricel. She didn't ring me to cry. She rang me with a plan. She'd been researching for a few weeks, she said. There was a market for mid-range clothing in Bohol, casual wear, workwear, school uniforms that wasn't being well served by local retailers. She knew suppliers in Divisoria, the wholesale garment district in Manila. She'd worked in clothing for 8 years, and she understood margins and stock cycles. She had 3 retail contacts in Tagbilaran who'd expressed interest in a regular supply arrangement. She walked me through it on a video call. Spreadsheet open in front of her. She'd costed the startup, initial stock, a trip to Manila to establish supplier relationships, a small storage space in Tagbilaran, basic business registration. She needed $720,000 to get off the ground properly, about $11,500. I want to tell you that I scrutinized this carefully. I want to tell you I asked hard questions about cash flow projections and break-even timelines. I did ask some questions, but I'll be honest, the part of my brain that should have been running the numbers had already made up its mind, and the questions were more for appearance than due diligence. Because here was the thing. I had watched Sivan talk for 30 years about the business she was going to start. The craft shop, the online thing, the catering idea. 30 years of ideas that never became anything, and that inertia had been, in its quiet way, one of the currents pulling us apart. And here was Maricel with a spreadsheet and supplier contacts and the names of 3 buyers already lined up, asking not for charity, but for startup capital. It felt like the opposite of everything I'd been living with. I sent mine $360,000 in July and another $360,000 in August. She went to Manila, sent me photos from Divisoria stalls of fabric and finished garments stacked to the ceiling, herself negotiating with suppliers in a language I couldn't follow. Stock arrived in Tagbilaran. Photos of her storage space, organized with a neatness that would have done credit to my own tool store. The first sales to the retail contacts, updates via WhatsApp with amounts and customer names and small difficulties navigated. It felt real because it was real. The business existed. I've no reason to believe otherwise. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that a business generating a real income removes a woman's need to be careful about how much she spends elsewhere. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was November 2023 when Maricel mentioned the land. We were sitting in a restaurant in Tagbilaran, a place that did good kara-kare and cold red horse, and she mentioned that her cousin Rodel had shown her something interesting. Rodel was a licensed real estate broker. He'd found a residential lot in a quiet barangay about 20 minutes from Tagbilaran city. Modest, not seafront, not spectacular. About 400 square meters on a flat site with road access. The asking price was Fru 24 million, roughly 38,000. She wasn't pushing it toward me. She was just mentioning it. That was the framing. We'd talked loosely before about what it might look like if I was here more permanently, and she was simply passing on something Rodel had seen. I could look at it or not. I looked at it. Rodel drove us out the following afternoon. He was a compact, efficient man in his 30s with a folder of documents that he laid out on the bonnet of his car with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times. Title deed, land registration, site survey, photographs, aerial view from his phone. Everything clean and organized. Here I need to stop and acknowledge something, because I think about this particular afternoon more than any other single moment in this whole story. I noticed that folder. I noticed how ready it was, not just the documents, but the sequencing of them, title first, then survey, then photos, as if he'd prepared a presentation. An estate agent anywhere in the world might do the same. But I clocked it. There was a slight feeling, just for a second, of something staged, as if this meeting had been prepared for rather than arranged. I filed it away. I dismissed it. Because the alternative that Maricel had orchestrated this, that the business and the relationship and the family warmth had all been stages in a process that was leading here, was a story I absolutely refused to inhabit. Not because I'd assessed the evidence and found it lacking, because I needed it not to be true. So I asked reasonable questions, got reasonable answers, and on the drive back I told Maricel the site looked good and I'd think about it. She nodded. Said no rush, Poe. There were other buyers interested, Rodell mentioned, but nothing signed yet. I want to note for anyone watching that the phrase, "nothing signed yet" from an estate agent anywhere in the world is almost always true and almost always deployed at exactly this moment in a conversation. I knew that. I filed that away too. I thought about it for 2 weeks back in Limerick. I went on the expat forums. I read about land ownership in the Philippines, which I already broadly understood. Foreigners cannot own land here. That's simply the law. No exceptions short of inheritance, and even then, it's complicated. The standard arrangement is exactly what Maricel had already explained. The title goes in her name. That's what everyone does. I found threads from other expats confirming this. I found warnings, too, actually careful lads pointing out that putting property in a girlfriend's name means the property belongs to the girlfriend. Legally, fully, with no instrument available to the foreigner short of a formal loan agreement or a cohabitation contract, neither of which I arrange. I knew the rules. I just thought knowing the rules was the same as being protected by them. As if understanding the risk and accepting the risk were two different things, and I was only doing the first one. I rang Maricel and told her I wanted to go ahead. She said that was good, and she'd let Rodell know, and she asked how I was getting on with the cold. It had been a brutal November in Limerick. She knew that because she always asked. That's one of the things I keep coming back to. She always asked. I transferred $2.4 million in January 2024, roughly $38,000. It went to a holding account Rodell managed for the title transfer process, which is how property transactions work here. The buyer doesn't pay the seller directly. There are taxes and transfer fees and a documentary stamp tax and a capital gains tax, all of which the buyer typically absorbs, and Rodell handled all of it. To his credit, the title did transfer. I saw the document. Maricel's name on it, clean and legal, registered with the provincial registry in Bohol. I had a bank transfer receipt. I had a WhatsApp conversation in which Maricel had said the land purchase was happening. I had no deed of sale in my name, no loan agreement, no cohabitation contract, no instrument of any kind that connected Brendan from Limerick to that 400 square meters of flat ground outside Tagbilaran. I had the transfer receipt and the feeling. I filed it under acceptable risk and started talking to contractors. Maricel sourced 3 quotes. I reviewed them back in Ireland, asked questions via WhatsApp, got back answers that seemed reasonable. We went with a man named Edwin, who had built 2 other houses in the same barangay and came recommended by a neighbor of Nana's. His quote was $2.8 million for the structure, Walls, roof, windows, doors, basic plumbing roughed in. About 44,000 at the rate then. I said fine. Maricel would manage the build from Tagbilaram. I'd come over twice during construction to check progress. I want to say something about Edwin, because this story has enough villains and he isn't one of them. He built a solid house, concrete block construction, rebar properly tied, roof trusses set well. I know because I walked every centimeter of it twice, and I've enough site experience to know when corners are being cut. They weren't. Edwin was a straightforward man who did what he was paid to do, and that was the whole of his involvement. The first construction visit was in April 2024. The walls were up to lintel height. I stood inside what would be the main living area. No roof yet, open to the sky, rebar sticking up at the corners, a tarpaulin over the materials pile in the corner flapping in the sea breeze that came up from somewhere beyond the tree line. Maricel stood beside me. She was pointing out where the kitchen would be, where she thought we should put the sliding door to the garden. I'm going to try to explain what I felt standing there, because I think it's important, and I think it's the part most people watching this will find hardest to understand. I spent 38 years maintaining other people's buildings. I kept their hospitals running, their factories lit, their shopping centers functional. I was good at it, and I was proud of it, and it was enough for most of my life. But I had never in 62 years stood inside something that was being built for me, not for a client, not for a contractor, not for anyone else. For me. On land I'd paid for in spirit, if not in law, with a woman I trusted standing next to me pointing at where the kitchen would go. It felt like the first genuinely good thing that had happened to me in 3 years. I'm not being dramatic about that, I just mean it plainly. The second tranche of construction payments went via Remitly in multiple transfers across the following months. Maricel would send me Edwin's billing statements, materials, labor, weekly invoices. I tracked them in a spreadsheet, which gave me a feeling of control that, in hindsight, was entirely cosmetic. The totals were 1 million in April, 990,000 in June, 640,000 in August, plus a contingency transfer in September for finishing materials, tiles, window glass, paint. Total construction outlay, approximately 325 million, which at the rates across those months came to roughly 52,000. More than Edwin's original quote, but construction always runs over. Every site I'd ever worked on ran over. I accepted the overruns because they were small, individually, and because I understood how builds work. My second visit was August 2024. The house was structurally complete. Roof on, windows in, concrete floor poured and cured. The interior walls were plastered but unpainted. The plumbing was roughed in. What it needed was finishing floor tiles, bathroom fittings, kitchen units, paint, and the electrical installation, which I'd already told Maricel I intended to do myself. 63 years old, and I was standing there mentally planning a domestic installation in my head. The kind I could do in my sleep. It felt right. It felt like something. I walked the whole building twice, checked the blockwork at the corners, ran my hand along the roof trusses, knocked on walls. It was solid. Edwin had done honest work. I shook his hand and paid the final invoice. Maricel and I sat on the step of the unfinished front door that evening and ate lumpia from a bag she'd bought at a roadside stall on the way over, watching it get dark over the barangay. Dogs somewhere. A generator starting up across the road. The smell of wood smoke and cooked rice from the neighboring houses. I said something about coming back in 3 months to do the electrics. She said she'd have the tiles sorted by then. We sat there a while longer without saying much. That was the best evening of the whole 2 years. I want to put that on the record. I flew home to Limerick in late August, back to the flat in Doradoyle. I had a plan now which was different from before. I was going to return in November, spend 3 months doing the electrical fit-out and supervising the finishing work, and by the following spring the house would be livable. After that, the thinking was longer stays, maybe permanent. I hadn't sorted the visa properly. You can extend a tourist visa in increments, but for anything genuinely permanent, you'd need a marriage visa or the SRRV retiree scheme, which requires a deposit of $10,000 with the Philippine Retirement Authority and a load of paperwork. I'd been putting that off, telling myself there was time. It was the last week of September when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I answered anyway. A man's voice, speaking fast in Cebuano. When I said hello in English, he switched broken phrases, something that sounded like a question, then nothing. He hung up. I sent Maricel a voice note asking about it within the hour. She replied quickly. A supplier of hers who had the wrong number, she said. She'd sort it. Nothing to worry about, Poe? I listened to her voice note twice. It was fine, calm, explanatory. All the right notes. I put the phone down and went back to what I was doing, which was looking at tile samples on a website, trying to decide between 2 shades of off-white for the kitchen floor. But something had changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way I could have pointed to if someone had asked. More like, if you've worked with electrical systems long enough, you develop a sensitivity to things that are slightly wrong. A flicker that isn't quite in rhythm. A sound that's a fraction off what it should be. Nothing you can prove. Just a system telling you, quietly, that something somewhere isn't right. I didn't pull on that wire. I should have. I went back to the tile samples instead. I was back in Limerick for a few weeks in late September, sorting things before the longer stay, getting my affairs in order, as they say, which in my case meant telling my landlord I might be subletting, talking to the bank about international transfers, the sort of administrative tidying you do when you're planning to be somewhere else for a substantial stretch of time. I was messaging Donald one evening, just catching up. Donald is my oldest friend in Limerick. We've known each other since we were apprentices together in the early 80s. He's a plumber, retired same as me, similarly at loose ends. I was telling him about the house, about the plan to go back in November. And I mentioned Maricel by name, her full name, first and surname both, because I was describing her properly for the first time, not just as someone I was seeing, but as someone I was building a future around. I wanted him to understand it was serious. Donald, who has a lot of time on his hands and an unsophisticated approach to privacy, typed her name into Facebook. He messaged me the next morning. Just a screenshot with a single line above it. Who's this fella? The screenshot was from a Facebook profile semi-public, not locked down, Maricel in what looked like a hotel room or a serviced apartment, standing close to a man. The man was not Filipino. He was white, possibly European, younger than me. The photos were dated February 2024. February 2024 was when Maricel had told me she was spending a week in Tagbilaran helping her mother after a health scare. I sat with that for 2 days. I want to be precise about what those 2 days felt like, because I think it matters. It wasn't rage. It wasn't the floor dropping out. It was more like the feeling you get when a job you've nearly finished develops a fault you can't immediately locate, a sour, specific dread. You know something is wrong. You don't know yet how wrong. You sit with your meter and you start checking circuits, and you hope you're going to find a minor thing, a loose connection, something fixable. I called her on video on the 3rd day. I asked about the photos without any preamble. She cried immediately. Not after a beat, not after a denial. Immediately. The crying came so fast it almost answered the question on its own. She said it was an old relationship, a man she had known before me. It had been a mistake. It was over. She had been ashamed to tell me because she knew what I'd think. She was sorry. She was so sorry, Poe. The photos disappeared from her profile within 24 hours of our call. I half believed her. That's the honest account of where I was. Not fully half. Because the timing was wrong, this wasn't before me, this was during, and the photos had disappeared too quickly, and the crying had been too immediate. But the alternative required me to dismantle everything I'd built in my head about what the previous 2 years had been, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. So I accepted the explanation with reservations I kept to myself and told her we'd talk more when I arrived in November. What I did next, I've thought about whether I'd have done it without the photos, and I honestly don't know. I told myself it was routine due diligence, sensible planning before a long stay, what any careful man would do before committing seriously to a property abroad. I found a Cebu-based solicitor through an expat forum, a Filipino lawyer with significant experience handling property disputes for foreign nationals. I emailed him the land title number and asked him to run a standard title check and review the registration status. He called me on a Tuesday morning, October. I remember because the clocks had just gone back and it was dark by 4 and I was sitting in the flat with the lamp on at 1:30 in the afternoon. He said the title was registered in Maricel's name as expected, fully transferred, clean legal status. I said, right, thank you. He said there was one other matter. A mortgage had been registered against the title approximately 6 weeks prior. A private lending company. The loan amount was $12 million, roughly $19,000. The security for the loan was the property. The signature on the mortgage instrument was Maricel's. The named beneficiary of the loan proceeds was a man whose address was listed as Davao City. I said nothing for a moment. He waited. I said, "Is that the Davao address?" He said yes. I thanked him, told him I'd be in touch, and ended the call. I flew to Cebu 4 days later. I didn't tell Maricel I was coming until I was at the gate at Dublin Airport. I booked a hotel in IT Park, the same one I'd stayed in on my first visit, which I suppose was some kind of instinct toward a fixed point. I met her in the lobby of the hotel the following morning. She was composed when she arrived. Controlled. I showed her the solicitor's summary on my phone. She read it. And then something in her face changed. Not collapsed exactly, but gave way. Like a wall that's been holding pressure for a long time, finally admitting the weight. She wept. She said it was for her daughter's schooling, for the family, that she had been desperate for money she couldn't ask me for because she'd already asked for so much. She said she loved me and she hadn't thought it would affect the house. She thought she could repay the loan before I found out. She said she was sorry. She said, please, Poe, she was begging me not to leave her over this. I told her I needed to think. She went to my room. I don't know how she knew which room she must have asked at the desk. I came up an hour later, and she was sitting on the floor outside the door. She'd been crying. She looked up at me and said, please. I went past her into the room. I sat on the edge of the bed. The air conditioning was too cold, and I didn't change it. I just sat there, looking at the wall. I wasn't angry. I want to say that clearly, because people expect anger, and I'm not sure I've ever felt less angry in my life. What I felt was a very particular kind of tired dot. The kind that isn't about sleep. The kind that comes from spending 2 years building something carefully in your head and then sitting in a cold hotel room, understanding that the building was done wrong from the foundation up, and there's nobody to call, and the job still has to be sorted. The solicitor's professional summary, delivered to me the following day in his office off Escario Street in Cebu, was straightforward. In Philippine law, my transfers were gifts. I had no legal standing as a property owner. Civil action was available to me in theory, expensive and slow in practice, and unlikely to recover meaningful amounts given the nature of what I could prove. What I had, he said, was the mortgage irregularity. Maricel had encumbered an asset that had been funded demonstrably from my bank records by my transfers, without my knowledge or consent, in favor of a third party with a Davao address. It wasn't a clean case, but it wasn't nothing. He said, in Philippine law, Mr. Brendan, your contributions are gifts. There is no instrument here that protects you. I said I understood that. He said, however, I said, "Tell me about the however." He told me. I listened carefully, the way I always listen when someone is explaining how something works. I gave myself a week before I did anything. I flew back to Limerick, went back to the flat, and sat with it. Not because I was wallowing, because that's how I've always worked. You don't start rewiring a panel when you're still worked up about the fault. You let the system cool. You come back when you can think. On the 8th day, I opened a spreadsheet. Every Remitly transfer since January 2023, every bank record, every WhatsApp message in which I had referenced the land purchase, the construction, the lot title, the building cost. I went back through 2 years of conversation and screenshotted every exchange that mentioned money, property, or Maricel's explicit acknowledgement that the land and house were being built for us. There were more of them than I'd realized. She had been, in her own way, careful about keeping the narrative consistent. What she hadn't anticipated was that I'd compile it. I engaged a second lawyer. Not the Cebu solicitor, he was solid, but his expertise was property. And what I needed now was someone with experience navigating civil disputes and pressure negotiations. I found a Filipino civil attorney through a recommendation on an expat legal forum, a woman based in Cebu City who had handled several cases involving foreign nationals and property irregularities. Her name was Adi Santos. She read my documentation over 2 days and called me on a Thursday. She said what I had was not a property claim. I already knew that. What I had, she explained, was a paper trail demonstrating that Maricel had used an asset funded by traceable foreign transfers as collateral for a personal loan whose beneficiary was a third party, without disclosing this encumbrance to the de facto funder of the asset. That, she said, had specific implications for the lending company, who had an interest in the provenance of the security, for Maricel, who faced potential fraud exposure if the documentation was submitted formally, and for the man in Davao, who, it turned out, had his own complicated relationship with the property and with the loan, and no desire whatsoever for any of this to receive official scrutiny. I won't pretend I understood every dimension of Philippine property law in play. I didn't need to. What I understood was leverage, and that I had some. The negotiation took 7 months. I want to be clear that I was not present for most of it. I was back in Limerick, back in the flat, communicating with Adi Santos via WhatsApp and email. There were weeks when nothing happened, and weeks when things moved quickly. Maricel's side, which was, in practice, her family and eventually the Davao man's people, made several approaches that amounted to appeals for sympathy. Her daughter, her mother, the circumstances. God's plan and His will were invoked more than once in messages relayed through counsel. I didn't respond to any of that, not because I was hard-hearted about it, but because I'd been in enough negotiations in my working life with contractors, with clients, with materials suppliers to understand that when the other side moves from legal argument to emotional argument, it means their legal position has weakened. You stay in your lane. You keep it professional. You let the lawyers talk. What unsettled them, Adi Santos told me later, was the absence of anger. They expected a furious Kano who needed to be calmed down and managed. They got correspondence. Itemized, referenced, dated. They expected emotion they could work with. They got accounting. The formal threat, delivered through counsel in March 2025, was precise. We would report the mortgage irregularity to the private lending company with full documentation of the transfers, submit a formal complaint to the relevant barangay and provincial authorities regarding the undisclosed encumbrance, and provide documentation to interested parties in Davao City regarding the nature and provenance of the collateral. None of this was certain to result in criminal proceedings. All of it was certain to create serious, sustained, expensive problems for everyone involved. In June 2025, Maricel's family produced $2.1 million. approximately 35,000 at current rates. It came in two tranches, sourced from what I understood to be a combination of family resources and a contribution from the DeVeo man, who had apparently done his own calculation and decided that paying to make this go away was cheaper than the alternative. Addie Santos drew up a release. I signed it. She countersigned. It was done. I want to give you the numbers cleanly, because I think that's the honest way to end this. I spent approximately $105,700 over the course of the 2 years. The roof repair, the business capital, the land purchase, the construction, the flights and accommodation, and all the small costs that normalize along the way. I recovered $35,000 through the settlement. Net loss, roughly $70,700, plus 2 years of my life, plus whatever the flat in Dooradoyle cost me while I was trying to retire somewhere else. I have approximately $68,000 left of the original $155,000. My daughter Ioife knows the broad shape of it. My son Kieran does not. I'll tell him when the time seems right, which may be never, which is also fine. Here is what I've learned, and I'll say it plainly because I think plain is what it deserves. I was not naive about the Philippines. I'd done research. I understood the property law. I understood the risks of putting a title in a partner's name. I read the forum warnings. I was aware of the pattern. What I was naive about was myself. I thought that needing something very badly was a kind of entitlement to it. I had lost a house and a marriage and a career in the space of 2 years, and somewhere in the back of my head I had decided that I was owed a second go. That the Philippines and Maricel and the house on that quiet barangay outside Tagbilaran were things I had earned by suffering enough. They weren't. You don't earn a second chance by suffering. You earn it by doing the work differently. And I didn't do the work differently. I did it with the same methodology I'd used in the marriage. I identified the risks. I understood them clearly, and then I proceeded anyway because the alternative was going back to the flat in Dooradoyle and accepting that the first version of my life was the only one I was going to get. The fault doesn't care how much you need the lights to stay on. I didn't make her regret it because I wanted revenge. I want to be clear about that. I made her regret it because it was the only language left that made any sense. When the conversation about trust and love and promises was over, and it was over, the day the solicitor called on a Tuesday morning, there was only the other conversation left. The one with documentation. The one I knew how to have. I'm back in Dooradoyle. It rains regularly. I walk most mornings. I watch less YouTube than I used to. That's where we leave Brendan. In a flat in Limerick, making peace with a version of his life he didn't choose but is learning to inhabit. Before we close, I want to say something to anyone watching this who might be somewhere in the middle of a similar situation. Whether you're 3 months in or 3 years in or just starting to feel that first cold drip of doubt. Brendan's story is not a story about Filipino people being untrustworthy. I want that stated clearly on this channel, because it matters. Millions of cross-cultural relationships in the Philippines are genuine, complicated, loving, and real. Filipino family obligation is not a scam. It's a culture that genuinely believes in caring for each other across generations, in ways that Western individualism often doesn't. Sometimes the collision between those expectations and a foreign man's resources ends in mutual misunderstanding rather than deliberate exploitation. Sometimes the line between the two is impossible to locate cleanly. What Brendan's story is about is the gap between understanding a risk and being protected from it. He knew the rules. He just trusted feeling over documentation, hope over legal instrument, need over due diligence. That gap cost him more than €70,000 and 2 years of his life. What he did right, eventually, is worth noting too. He didn't rage. He didn't spiral. He documented everything, engaged professional counsel, identified specific leverage, and applied it with the same quiet, methodical competence he'd spent 38 years perfecting. He recovered something. Not everything, but something. If you're considering property in the Philippines, land, a house, a build, the name on the deed is not a formality. It is the whole story. Everything else is just the story you're telling yourself until the solicitor calls on a Tuesday morning. Thanks for being here. We'll see you on the next one. This is Inside the Philippines.